You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Autumn Burt and Jasper Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Jesper.
And I'm Autumn.
This is episode 147 of the AmWritingFantasy podcast, and we've finally arrived at our new initiative. So once a month, we are reading a high-profile fantasy book, and then we record a podcast episode about it. So this is our critical reading of 5th season by N.K. Jemisin.
Yes, I'm looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty because I admit some of the aspects of this one were what kind of gave me the idea for the critical reading group when we were first talking about it. But I also don't know if listeners will be surprised at our I think we both have a very similar takeaway from this book. But there's some aspects of this one that are like, oh, that is so different. It's amazing. I see why it won a Hugo Award. This is such a cool book. And there's other aspects that, well, we'll get there, won't we?
Yes. You're already teasing it.
Yeah. Well, we got to make people want to listen to like the heart of this one. They should be excited.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And of course, the idea is also here to see if we can try to draw out some things to learn in terms of either these are good ideas or this kind of stuff you should probably avoid. You know, that kind of thing is what we're trying to draw out of the critical reading.
Exactly.
And, well, we'll get to it, but it's all matter of opinion, obviously. So, yes, you can disagree with us. That's okay. It's just our opinions. But, yeah, we'll get to it.
Sounds good. Well, if we're going to get to it, how are things going for you over in Denmark?
Yeah, well, I don't think I have that much to share this week. I'm just attempting to finish up the first draft of book 2 in our new series. So a couple of chapters to go, and maybe I will be done by Friday, I hope.
Oh, don't tell me that.
Yeah, that's my hope. Well, you should be happy about that, Autumn.
I'm very happy, but I was hoping to finish the edits on book 1, which always seem to be getting pushed back ever so slightly. I'm so close, maybe the end of next week, but you're gonna beat me on the end of book 2. I will catch up eventually.
Yeah. So I don't think I have that much other to share this week. It's just been, what do you call it? Like head in the sand. No, not head in the sand. That's not good. But in the trail, or how do you say?
Head in the clouds. Head in the clouds.
That was not what I was looking for. But nevertheless, I know you were at some fantasy con or something.
Yes, I went to a Vermont fantasy and sci-fi con up in Burlington, and that was a lot of fun. I was there. There was definitely, I think, more than 50% sci-fi, but at the same time, it was so much fun. I thought of you several times because they had a R2-D2 that was like truly moving. You could have mistaken it for the R2-D2 from the movies. And the guy who could control it was so good. Like, he didn't have to look down at the remote, and the remote was so small, you didn't even really notice who was responsible. And this little thing would come up to your booth, and it would be talking to you and making woo! Like, this is awesome. And there was
nice.
If anyone like Ghostbusters, there was a gorgeous Ghostbusters car and some plasma things, but one of the coolest things is definitely the Star Wars, and there was the 501st Legion for the Stormtroopers, some representatives there. And so there's these guys walking around in full Stormtrooper armor. And the coolest thing is that they had to go upstairs to the conference room, and I happened to be up there, and I look out and I see one in the hallway, and I'm pointing out to my husband, and he ran out there and got a picture just as the elevator doors were closing. It looks so Star Wars. I'm like, that is the best picture ever. So I kind of like that one framed. It's just always, if you're going to take a picture of a Stormtrooper, it should be in an elevator. It's just so cool.
I've always loved those uniforms, to be honest. I think I've always, also in the movies, when they seem, they just look so cool. And sometimes I feel like it's a shame that they're just like cannon fodder in the movies, the stormtroopers, because they look so cool.
They look so cool. It's a very cool armor. And I was actually, I've been part of the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism. I used to do that back in my 20s. And so I really enjoyed that. But I didn't know there was a 501st Legion of Stormtroopers. I'm like, dude, you can go and dress up and be a Stormtrooper. That is cool.
Yeah, well, I would rather be the Sith Lord, to be honest.
Probably. I would want to go in as a Jedi Master, but I do come from a fantasy background. I think any fantasy author should automatically get to be a Jedi or Sith Master. Just, it's in our resume.
Yeah. See, you pick the good guys, and I automatically pick the bad guys. I don't know what that tells people.
Well, we have to balance each other's out. It's the Force. There's balance.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
All right.
A week on the internet with the Am Writing Fantasy podcast.
One last reminder here. On the 28th of October, we are having our very first ever virtual masterclass.
Woo! Can't wait. It's on maps. I love fantasy maps.
Fantasy maps, yes. And if you can't make it in person, there will be a recording made available for you as well. So I don't know. I'm looking so much forward to just geeking out for an hour about fantasy maps. This is going to be so awesome.
It'll be almost better than Fantasy Con. So yeah, it'll be fantastic.
Yeah, we'll have a lot of fun, and we'll share some thoughts on map making that you might not have considered before. So whether you want to learn something or if you just want to, well, geek out with us, we hope that you will join the masterclass. It is very inexpensive, and it is conducted online, so you don't need to leave your house or anything like that to attend.
And in fact, it's actually a really good deal because it's not only inexpensive, but it's a 2-for-1. You get a second, an invitation to a second masterclass, as you have to be scheduled. So, it's a 2-for-1 deal. Right. It's a really good deal, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a link in the show notes, and you can find the registration page from there. And we really hope to see you. Otherwise, it'll just be you and me, Autumn. And I think talking, we can talk to ourselves about map making, but it might be slightly boring.
Maps are never boring.
That's true. And
on to today's topic.
Okay, so while we are doing critical reading here today, I think we better start out by saying that the purpose here is to learn from the books that we read, not to bash them or claim that anything is wrong with these with this book in this case. And we should also say that the 5th season is a very popular book. It was awarded by the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 2016, and this means that there's a lot of people loving this novel.
Oh, yeah.
So everything we say is personal opinions, and we fully understand that some people will disagree with that, and that's okay.
Yes, exactly. And actually, I didn't realize this, but it also has won the Sputnik Award. It was nominated for a Nebula Award, and it's a World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. This is a highly acclaimed story, so I think it'll be really interesting to look at it, but it's definitely, that's why we want to learn why this is so popular, and it's okay to, find things that you don't like about it, but that's why it's a learning experience, to find maybe the core features that you love, and then, learn from those, and maybe learn what you want to stay away from especially if people are leaving reviews or comments that you agree with, and you can say, well, then there are readers who don't want that as well. That's great.
And we gave plenty of warning as well leading up to this episode that we were going to do this critical reading, so we are not going to be careful about spoiling anything here. So if you haven't read the book and you want to, I suggest that you turn off the podcast now and then come back to listen to the rest once you have done the reading part. So
Yeah.
I might say, or I think I will definitely say some spoiler stuff.
Yes, I will definitely too. And I had written down the exact same thing on my notes for today, that spoilers will follow this. So if you are still reading and haven't finished or plan on reading it, we're going to ruin the book for you. So stop now and go and finish the book, and then come back and listen and see if you agree.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I tried to divide sort of my notes into some headlines.
Okay, great.
So I have a headline called plotting, one called magic, and one called world building. And then I have a bunch of stuff underneath each header there. So I don't know if we just want to start out with the plotting header and then go from there, or do you have a different preference?
That sounds fine, though I wanted to start with maybe a quick explanation of what the 5th season is. I don't want to do a whole blurb and synopsis. We're hoping you read the book, so
Okay.
you know what's about. But just to set the stage, the 5th season is, we have our summer, spring, winter, fall. Well, the 5th season kind of lends its name to a world-ending event, like a cataclysm, a major earthquake, something that is going to destroy civilization. So it doesn't come every year, but when it comes, it's known as the 5th season. So it's actually a very ominous title once you realize that.
It is definitely so, yes. Okay,
I've
so we'll assume people have read it, or otherwise go and check the book description on Amazon, and
yes,
you can see what it's about.
yes.
So should I just get started on the plotting stuff, and then we
Well,
can
I was
just see
thinking
where it takes us?
maybe we should start almost with the way we would write books, and we should start with the world building.
Okay, fair enough. We can do that.
Okay.
Um, so I can start out with my first point here. It's a bit of a long one, but let me try to get through it.
Sure.
So first of all, this is from a world building perspective. It's incredibly complex. With all
Yes.
there's all this seismic activity that is impacting on society, and we have slaves, we have outcasts, and
Yes.
to some extent, this book is also about people dealing with being controlled and abused and having a totalitarian regime. And while I do enjoy the exploration of these sort of horrible things that people are willing to do to each other as soon as they don't see the other person as a human being anymore.
Mhm.
But I'm still wanting it to be more personal. You know, I have to sort of mention, I don't know if it's directly world building, but it's in here in my notes.
Okay.
But in this context, I have to mention that the second person present tense that the N.K. Jemisin uses, it's probably the reason why the book won the Hugo Award, to be honest, because it's different and it is very well done. I mean, don't get me wrong, she pulls it off very, very skillfully. Um, However, none of that changes how it really puts me off. I just cannot get into the story and the characters. I don't know how you feel about that, Autumn.
I agree. I had a very hard time relating to the characters, especially the main character, which we can get to later. But again, we're not giving anything away. But I wasn't sure if we were not supposed to realize that the older woman, the middle aged, the motherish woman, and the child were the same person. But I mean, as soon as we switched between the two, I knew instantly that the little girl was the same as the older woman who had just lost her son, who was the same as the mother. I don't know if it's because we write enough fantasy and it's like, well, duh. Or, the idea of the goddess who's the maid, the mother, the crone. I mean, it was just so obvious. And so I knew the whole time that this is going to be the same person. And I still never related to her. But to go on your comment on the second person, I agree. That's what makes this story literary fantasy, is that it switches between a third person point of view to a second person present tense, and it's amazing that it's done. And I didn't notice it as fast as some people who have left comments on what they thought of the story as they read along for today's podcast. So I think I was about a quarter of the way through the book, and I was like, oh, this is using you, and this is using present tense, and this is not what was in this previous chapter. But I will say, as a literary story, I think it was done very purposefully, because the chapters where the second person is used are the ones where the character has just lost her son, and she goes into shock and doesn't recover for days. And she doesn't really recover for the entire course of the novel because that point of view is always in second person. She is disassociated from herself and her emotions. And it works so well. The use of you makes it feel like you're separate from this character, especially compared to the chapters where it's third person. And so I think in that way it works great. But I never bonded with her because this is the adult version. This is the present version of who she is. And all the other ones are memories, which they're past tense. Makes sense. Brilliant writing. But for character, wanting to hear more about this character, I told you I can share it later, but I have a quote who basically I grabbed a review, and her title to the review are "My feelings for this book are complicated, leaning towards negative." And I'm like, oh, I could have written this one. And she too mentions that she couldn't bond with the main character.
No, and I agree with what you said, because I also think that the NK Jemisin chose that point of view on purpose to exactly do what you said there, like to give you the sense that the character is disassociated. Oh, I can't even say that now, I'm too tired. but that's definitely the purpose of it, and it works for sure. But at the same time, if you're looking at it from a immersion perspective, like you want to get in the body of the character, you want to see and feel with them as they go through the story and get immersed inside the setting and in their lives and all that good stuff. Like that's what I enjoy when reading, to just disappear into this sort of fantasy world and go with the characters. And that's what you get with the deep point of view. We talked about that in a previous episode as well, but that is what keeps me fully engaged. And it just doesn't happen here because as a reader, I'm also distanced from it because of the second person. And I feel like that's a real shame. And I think Steven from Patreon, he also said something that I really felt like was true, because he said, like, quote, "The point of views were a stumbling block for me at first, but I read on, thanks to you guys, with a critical eye so that I could see what made this book tick, and then it hit me. The prose, the writing style, it was so lyrical and almost poetic in places." And I think that hits it home for me, because I fully agree. That's also how I see it. It is more lyrical and poetic than it is storytelling in many places. Yes. And for those who love that, then that's great. But I just can't get into the character and the story. I just feel almost like I don't care.
Yeah.
And that's a shame in my view.
It is a shame. It is a shame for a book that I think has such potential, because the world is really interesting, and it sort of relates to what you just said about the lyrical writing. To me, I saw it more like poetry, but minimalized. The world is a very harsh world. The book has some really harsh themes, things that I don't usually like to think about when I'm reading fantasy. It's dark fantasy to me. And the magic is also hard. It's hard. It is basically earth magic. And so you have this hard world. It's described very harshly. The language to me is very bare, at times fractured, very punctuated. It reminds me very much of geology and earth and different types of rock and layers. So it's like this whole thing is designed to be this hard surface, this rocky surface that can, at times it pokes you and it's painful. And that is just, as a writer, as someone studying writing, I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to read this in, a college class, and I want to break it down and discuss it. But as a reader, I'm like, I didn't bond. I didn't feel it. I didn't buy book 2 because I didn't have that, warm gooiness of, oh my god, I love this book. It was more like, I can appreciate this on a literary sense and a scene, and I see why it was done. Kudos to you. And yeah, good. Don't need to write like that. Thanks.
No, I agree. And I think I read somewhere that N.K. Jemisin didn't intend for the setting to represent our world and its like future destruction. I could be wrong about that, but I think I read that somewhere. But one of the characters do call it Earth, so there is
Oh,
that.
I
But
didn't
I
pick that up.
sort of
Good.
quite like the reflections on real life here. You know, whatever, whether the author intended it to be so or not, I don't know, but I think it is pretty cool to think about, from a climate perspective in our real world and so on. And yeah, I mean, it gives sort of the real world angle and thing, and I guess that's the kind of thing that also gets awards, right?
Mm.
Because there's more to it than just a story.
Yes. Especially the end, the last thing that Alabaster, the one character, mentions is, have you ever heard of a moon? And this planet that they're on, it's a supercontinent now, so it's like Pangea, but it's called the Stillness. And so it's this vast continent, and it doesn't have a moon. And suddenly, the last phrase is like, mentions a moon. So is this a future Earth that has been torn apart with earthquakes and all this fracturing going on? It's very interesting. And I know over on world building too, I do the previous cultures that are there, they call them the dead civs. So you see all these ruins of previous cultures, and some of them sounded so technologically advanced. And there's parts in the
Hmm.
book where there's a lot of description, and then there's like a dead civ in the distance. And I'm like, I want to know more about the ruined cities. I would have been like, hard hat on, I am going to go check it out. But they're basically, the culture is, oh, we don't go there. They failed. Screw them. I'm like, no, I love history. I want to know why they failed. Can't you learn from previous lessons and become something better and not just wipe the canvas clean and start over and fail again? So there was that element too, where maybe it is describing our current world where we're not learning from past mistakes and past things, and we're repeating ourselves. And this just kind of does it with civilizations.
Yeah, that makes sense to me at least. I don't know if that is the intention, but it makes sense that it's a commentary on the real world. I feel like,
Yeah.
but I don't know. It adds a bit more depth to it, which I actually quite like.
Yes. And I was definitely teased by the floating obelisks, pyramids. I forget how they're described. They have a couple of different ones, but these floating blocks of stone. And I couldn't believe that that there was very little curiosity about what they were, except for Alabaster trying to figure it out, and a young girl in the girls' viewpoint. I can't remember her name, but when she's a child and she's at Fulcrum learning to become uh, I can't even pronounce it. Originist. Originist is what they call their magic system.
I'm
I
not
actually
even gonna try.
I had to look up how to say it because it is a real world. And so I looked up, and so there's this girl, and she's curious, but it's like two people in the entire book are curious about these giant floating things in the sky that are made out of stone. And again, I find the lack of curiosity, which is something that is true for the whole book, and especially the main character. She's never curious. And that's sort of against who I am as a person. I thrive off of wanting to know what things, why things are this way. And so I really think that did not help me relate to the book, because there's not a single character who's like, well, why does this happen? What happened here? They don't care.
Yeah, and the other aspect of what you're saying, I feel like is I don't feel like there's enough at stake for the protagonist. I mean, yes, she is searching for her daughter, but the rest of what happens, like you're talking about the obelisk and all this kind of thing, all of that is sort of dealt with because, well, it's my job, so I'm dealing with it. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not like, I mean, I just can't help but questioning here if we're trying to learn from it, what would have happened if the author had found a way to link all of this stuff around the obelisk and all that other stuff closer to the life of the character so that it made a personal difference for the character, whether she dealt with it or not, instead of just, I'm taking care of my job.
Yes.
I just feel like that would be a lot more interesting.
Yes, I feel like the entire plot, which you said you have a whole section on the plot. I feel like the whole plot revolved around the present search for her daughter, and then how she got to where she is now, which are the two past point of views, where there was some really cool stuff, like, the first time she bonds with an obelisk and a volcano erupts, and I'm still not sure if that was her, the obelisk, or Alabaster somehow making this volcano appear. And I thought, oh, ooh, this is going to start connecting with her. And immediately, the next part, she doesn't even really ever think about them again. And then when she moves on with the present tense, where she's been a wife and a mother in this new town, and it begins with her losing her son, she's never even wondered about, again, anything. The obelisk, the things that I thought, like, oh, you've connected with an obelisk, and it's an alien intelligence, and it was talking to you. Okay, not mentioned for the next 50 chapters. I was like, oh, I want to know more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have some issues there, and I thought as well, if I just say infodumps, do you then know what I'm thinking about, Autumn?
I do. I think they hit you worse, especially because you were listening, and I think maybe I just kind of skimmed them and didn't realize I was skimming them, but you said that there were more info dumps than I realized.
Well, at least it feels like that to me. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I was listening to the audiobook version. Oh, and can I just say, if you haven't, listeners, if you want to check this book out, the narrator for the audiobook is freaking amazing. She does such a good job at narrating this book, so that's definitely worth it. I can highly recommend this narrator. She's so good at it. But I digress. But what I meant was just that I noticed in several places how, well, maybe you don't notice it so much when reading, and I'm speculating here, but because of the very lyrical language, and she's so good at writing, that maybe you don't really notice that much, but there are quite a lot of infodumps, in my view, where you just get like a whole section about something that happened like in the older days, or blah blah blah, something is like, yeah, okay, but if I read it in a book, and maybe if it was maybe less written, I could put it like that, then I would just feel like, well, put all of this conversation between characters or something, so that I get as part of the action of what's happening, or characters talking about it and share it that way, because it feels like sometimes there's just a whole sections about old history stuff, and it's like, okay, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and I
Maybe
noticed
it's just me.
One of the reviews mentioned that if they had to read another description of meeting someone on the road and what they were wearing and what their hair color was, that she would go, and how you knew which part of the continent they were from based on these things, that it just seemed too repetitive. And, I didn't really quite notice that, except I know sometimes I would, again, probably just skim ahead a little bit, be like, okay, that's nice. I don't need to know all the details. So, again, I don't mean to be pointing out the flaws, but I think we're pointing out the difference between what's literary fantasy and what is normal, like dark fantasy, what we expect in the two genres. And this is literally sold as literary / epic / science fiction. So it's a weird mishmash, where I think it fits better actually with literary fantasy than it does with dark fantasy.
Yeah, I do too, because I mean, as I hinted at just a moment ago, the writing is exceptionally well done. I mean, she writes really, really beautiful. I have nothing to say against that. It's amazing.
And the world is, like you said, it's deep and it's up. Yeah, sorry.
But yeah, and that's what I mean. If that's what you're there for, then it's great, right? But if you're there for more like what I guess I could call commercial fiction, you meaning you're there to enjoy a story and so on, then this is not it.
No. And I think part of also the not bonding and the plot feeling sort of flat, that all these potential side plots could have happened, but they don't, because one, the character is not curious, but it's also the character. What kind of character arc would you call this? I'm thinking it's either a fail or a flat arc. And because she never learns, she never grows, she's not curious at all, she doesn't change, the plot is kind of static.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that a bit when I talk about the ending, but I'll
Okay.
save that for a moment. But I did have another comment from Steven on Patreon as a last comment I have at least on my list when it comes to world building, because I think he might have a good point here. But I'm curious what you think,
Mm.
Autumn. So he says, "quote." The one aspect of the world building that I didn't care for is that she made up many curse words like rust and rusting, and yet she still used several modern curse words. This is probably nitpicky, but if you make up your own curse words that fit the culture of your story, why use modern common curse words too? So I think he has a point, doesn't he, Autumn?
I think he does. I don't know if I would have. I don't. Can't say I super noticed it. I noticed like when she was using rusting and
No, me
stuff.
neither.
Yeah, I like the ones that she made up because again, it fits the world. It fits this culture of very like metal is not considered safe because it rusts. Rust is a bad thing. It leads to dead civs. But I don't think I noticed
Yeah.
too many modern words and what they were. And so yeah, I think as a I would think I would appreciate them more if she had stuck left them in the world that she was, especially if this is not supposed to be a future Earth where people are still saying F this. So
Yeah, I get the point that Steven is making, to be honest, but at the same time, I must admit sometimes you can just put in the F word. I mean, I know there is a lot of debates. I've seen it many times being debated whether or not there should be an F word in a fantasy novel. Personally, I don't have any problem with it,
yeah.
but yeah, I don't know. I still get the argument.
Mm. I I've used it because it fit. It was actually set in modern day Earth, but yeah, I mean, as long as it's not aimed targeted at kids, I don't have a problem with using some of our language because they're already speaking English, so why wouldn't they have some of the same swear words? I mean, at that point, why are you not making up all the
Yeah,
names? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you making up every word? Just let's keep it simple.
yeah, yeah, indeed. Yeah. So that was sort of my notes on the world building parts.
Okay.
Um, and if I just go into, let's say, well, we talked about a lot of the plotting stuff already, but what I did want to mention as well, something very positive, because I really like how we are following three women. Well,
Oh
it's the
yeah.
same person, of course, but essentially there's three women here in different ages. But I really like that because I just don't think that there is enough fiction out there with female protagonists, to
Mm.
be honest, and I really like that.
Yes, I actually it was funny being female. I didn't even think about it, but you're right. It was nice to have that and have that point of view, and that also she was a very capable and determined woman in many ways. She could take care of business.
Yeah.
She knew what she was doing. She had when she was younger, she was pushed around a little bit, but she overcame that. I guess about the only growing she does do.
Yeah, agree. The thing is, though, as you said before, it's just too easy to guess that it's the same person.
Yeah,
I also guessed it almost immediately.
yeah,
But at least, I mean, if we disregard the fact that maybe some people didn't guess it, I
yeah,
don't know. But if we disregard that for a second, the fact that there is a plot twist or surprise in the story, which if you didn't guess it, it is a surprise at the end. I think that is a very good idea to take away from as a learning experience. To try to have something that will surprise and excite readers once they get to that final parts of the story, and they're like, "Whoa!" That kind of thing is great.
yes. Agreed. I mean, I'd be surprised if people didn't. I guess it's hard in how you're reading it. If you truly, she does make the setting. She doesn't tie them together at all, really, until that kind of twist at the end where you realize it's all the same character. But she also didn't really go out of her way to make it seem too different. Like why they might, hints that it was the same time. So I think it was a pretty easy guess that they're the same ones. So it wasn't a huge twist, but it could have been. It is always good
Yeah,
to have a twist like that.
but honestly, I think if you did not have the second person, if all of them had been third person limited,
Mhm.
I don't think I would have guessed it.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
it's because the second person stands out so much that I knew that it has to be linked to the other people in there, and maybe it's something to do with different in different times or something. I don't know. It was just so different that I knew that it had to link together somehow, and then I could just add the two and two together, and then I
Mhm.
guessed it right away, almost
Yeah.
right. But if you had three third-person limited point of views, then I might not have guessed it, to be honest.
That's interesting. I think because I hadn't noticed the second person, at least consciously at that point. I just, again, I think it's kind of Celtic, kind of the maid, mother, and crone. As soon as it switched to a little girl, I'm like, oh, this is her as a child. I just, because she was mad, she had the same power. It just seemed right to me. There was enough of the character in there as even a little girl that I'm like, yeah, this is the same one. So, but I think everyone would pick it up in their own path. But because the book, like you were saying, makes you think, you start trying to think and solve it pretty quickly.
I have to ask, how could you not notice? I mean, the second person is like, it jumps right at you. I mean, it's like, oh, what is going on here? I mean, instantly. I mean, how can you not notice that?
I don't know. I was reading it at night, and if I was just tired, or it was a very good, and like I said, I first noticed that the magic being an earth magic, which I had to laugh because of how many times you've picked on me for my debut novels, Elemental Magic. I'm like, here's a Hugo Award winner. It's only earth element. But the harshness of the word and the language and just how everything just felt like geology. And I'm a huge geology geek. I mean, if you like earth and granite and schist and these big geological terms, oh my gosh, read this book and geek out, and no one will know you're totally geeking out over just the geology. So I think I was so caught up going, oh, this is so cool. Her language is harsh, the world is harsh. I love how it all ties together. I can't imagine the number of revisions to make it sound this way, and everything ties together that I just never even noticed that it was second person.
Jesus Christ, you must have been tired. It's like as soon as I got to that in the audiobook, it was like I had to pause it. Like, what is going on here? It was just so incredibly different and weird all of a sudden, and that from that point on, I just couldn't get into it. So it did, but I agree with regards to the magic system. Just imagine, I would hate to do all that research she must have done in order to pull this off, and all this seismic stuff and figuring out how it all moves, and oh my god, there must have been a lot of research behind that magic system, but it is very well done, and I have to applaud her for it.
Absolutely. Unless she happened to be or have in the family a geologist, and so she was kind of geeking out on it as well. So I could see that. But yeah, you would definitely have to have an interest in deep earth sciences to come up with this magic
Yes.
system and make it so. She talks about fault lines, and some things can only happen here and only happen there, and probably you're not into geology,
Yeah.
and not into really cool magic, there's probably going to be times you're like, oh my gosh, please stop describing rocks to me. But I loved it.
I did too. I think because also I feel like it's a different magic system to what at least maybe there's already some magic system based on seismic activity and so on, but I've just not seen it before. Maybe it exists, but I'm not aware. But at least it was different enough that I thought it was very cool.
Yeah, definitely very cool. And I would say, because wanted to point out, and I think one of the things that, though, where I fell out of the book and what lost me is that is with the main character, the present tense, the second person, a son, is I think what lost me is, again, her arc. I assume it's a flat arc to slightly fail, but she never learns from her mistakes, which, again, that would be a grow arc. But I just, there was one point, what should have been the climax, where I'm sure you remember it. She's on the pirate ship. She's had this safe haven. She's in a really good place, but she's bored, and so she goes on a pirate ship, and she is literally the one. She uses her magic and pokes this spear up through the boat, and she realizes once she does it that I shouldn't have made it visible because now they know there's this rogue earth magic orogeny, and so we're going to basically have to kill everyone. She's the one who realizes it, and literally the next chapter she goes and stops an entire volcano. No one's going to notice a volcano suddenly just going away. I wanted to bang my head, and then she goes to Alabaster, probably the most intelligent character in the whole book, the one who's really a forward thinker, and he's curious. And she tells him, he knows that she did this, and he gets mildly like upset when she says, "Oh, I saw someone on the shore," and he's like, "Oh, we should, we'll have to be careful." She quelled an entire volcano. He should have been jumping up and shaking her, saying, "You just gave away where we are. That was 20 miles from here." And so this leads to the death of her first son. The book starts with the death of her second son. I'm like, that is when I think I decided I wasn't reading book 2, was when I read through that climax and I'm like, this is supposed to be the clincher for the book, and I don't care. I'm mad at the character.
Yeah, I cannot disagree with that. I have some points about that ending as well, but I just want to finish off one thing that Stephen said about the magic as well. First, so Stephen from Patreon said, quote, "The magic system was very unique. Orogeny definitely adheres to Sanderson's laws of magic, wherein orogeny has limits. Orogeny has a cost, and the reader is given a clear understanding of how orogeny is in this world, so that he or she has a willing suspension of disbelief. In other words, it's believable. Magic fits well into the story, and it isn't used always to solve the problem or conflict in the story. In fact, for all intents and purposes, magic is both the problem and the solution in the 5th season." I think that sums it up very nicely.
I think that does as well. And even to add to that the magic system has the 10 rings, the tiers, so you even have, what level people are at and what they can kind of do at those levels. It's well done. I like that. Yeah, you start off as a novice and what you have to do to advance, and how your attachment to the magic grows.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get to the ending here. You touched upon some of it already. So I want to say a few other things in addition to what you already mentioned. Because I feel like the ending just leaves way too many things completely open-ended. I don't necessarily have anything against cliffhangers. I know a lot of people do, but it doesn't bother me personally that much. But please, when you write a story, at least give the reader a certain degree of closure. Just something to at least give a sense of what is going on here. If you can take the Stone Eaters as an example. By the end of this book, I have no idea what these Stone Eaters want, or how it all sort of links together. I have no idea. We also don't know what happened to Ison's husband and child. I understand that this is the first book in the series, but it just left me slightly frustrated. And if I'm honest, very honest, I have to say that I did not like this book at all.
I agree. The ending, especially, it felt more like the first third of a novel than the first book in a series. It didn't have that book ending, and I thought it was interesting. We never, in the entire story, we hear that Isan has a daughter. I'm sure we hear her name, but we never see her. Not even in a memory. And so it's hard to feel that Mother's like, she gets distracted, she goes up all over the map, you're reading about 2 other points of view of her, that I never felt a huge bond. She's kind of just like the Walking Dead, and just, this is her mission. It's her last living child. She will find her daughter, but there's no bubbling passion with that at all. And so I just kind of thought it was, really weird that we have this huge pivotal character that is the reason the woman is, walking forever and what happens to her. And we don't ever see her even in a memory. And that just seems very strange to me.
Yeah. So maybe it would be fair to say that on the plus side, you have amazing world building,
Yes.
lyrical writing, and you also have, um, well, sort of commentary, maybe, or at least there is, even if it wasn't intended by the author herself, but there is something you could use at least as commentary to our real world and the real situation with climate changes and so on. So that's sort of on the plus side, and I guess those things, and well, not on the plus side, but the use of second person
Yeah.
in order to emphasize how the character feels. Those are sort of the things I think is what gives you the awards, because
Yes.
it is different and it is commentating on more than just being a story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why she has won the awards, I feel like.
Yes.
But on the negative side, to me, you have a very the plotting doesn't add up. It doesn't connect well. There is several times, like you've mentioned, things that happen where it's like it doesn't really make logical sense why the character doesn't question this or look into this, or there are several places like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also very much missing the personal stakes that we talked about as well.
Yes.
And if you're reading it for a good immersive fantasy story, then yeah, that goes on the minus side as well, because it just does not succeed on this at all.
Yes, I agree. The tropes, the things that we'd expect from commercial fiction are that make it immersive and maybe build up the passions just aren't there. But for the literary aspects, for how well it is put together and how well it all fits together in a literary sense, the writing, the magic, the world building, the use of second persons versus third person, it's amazingly well put together and it deserves the award. But if you're working on it from more of a commercial and epic or dark fantasy, it is just not as adhesive. It doesn't have what people are looking for, which is often characters, and characters are what make you turn the page. And that wasn't what drove this story. And so I think that's a really important takeaway is it's the character. I wouldn't even say it's a building, but I did read some of the reviewers said that the characters were just shallow. They didn't have that depth. It always stayed kind of on the surface. And the few times you thought you saw more, sometimes they contradicted each other. It wasn't very solid.
Yeah, no, I can agree with those reviewers, because that's exactly the point here, right? I think everything here depends on how you look at it, right? Because as a reader, what I appreciate when reading is the good story, the good characters. That's the sort of stuff that I enjoy.
Yes.
But of course, I also have to respect that many other people, they enjoy the other aspects that I had on the plus side just a second ago, right? I'm not going to mention them once again here, but those things that I mentioned before on the plus side, some other people, they love that stuff. So yeah, I think a lot of it, well, it is like that for any book ever written. Some people love it, some people hate it. That's the way it is. But I can only speak for myself, and this is not the type of book I enjoy reading at all.
Yeah, and I will definitely.
It's a bit of a shame, because honestly, once I started reading it, because of all the awards, I actually had quite high expectations that this was going to be awesome, and then I felt pretty disappointed, to be honest.
Yeah, and I would also say that I was surprised that this one did not come with any trigger warnings in the blurb, maybe because it's an award winner, but I mean, my books are so much more mild, but I mean, this is literally sexual molestation, exploitation, the death of children. There's some really horrible, dark themes in this one that I was shocked at.
Yeah, that's true.
And there was no trigger warning, and I was like, wow, I am shocked. I have a slightly rough sex scene, and I had a reader put a trigger warning on my book, and I like, don't touch this one. This one's going to really hurt.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I have some final remarks, but I don't. Do we have more on your note list, Autumn?
No, I think that covers pretty much everything. And like I said, if you go into there's a review by N. Beasley. It comes up as the highest ranked critical review, because 5 people have found it helpful, and I think it sums up really well the aspects that are so interesting about this book. I mean, she or he gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. Just, it's such an interesting, complexly written book, but it's also not what you expect if you're reading commercialized fantasy or science fiction.
No, fully agree. Okay, so what I wanted to do to finish off here is I want to take the chance to thank Stephen for his inputs on Patreon. It is just so much more fun when we have people reading along with us here. And of course, if you, dear listener, also want to provide input for future critical reading episodes and us sort of taking your comments into the actual podcast episode like we did for Stephen here, then just make sure to join on Patreon, and there is a link in the show notes for that. Next Monday, I will have an interview with the extremely popular and successful YouTuber Jenny Moresi, and we'll talk about using YouTube as an author.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWritingFantasy podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jasper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get awesome rewards and keep the AmWritingFantasy podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.